She was just a secretary, overworked, overlooked, heartbroken after 6 years with the wrong man, and now holding everything together for a mother who could no longer remember her name. One night, alone in a dim kitchen, she opened her laptop and typed 5 simple words: Event Companion, Service, Oregon. Not for love, not even for hope, just to feel visible. But when a man named James Halston showed up, wearing quiet confidence and a $500 price tag, everything shifted. Why did he speak like someone born into boardrooms? Why did he know things about her company? No outsider should. And what happens when a woman who's forgotten how to dream meets a man who spent his life hiding behind wealth? This isn't a fairy tale. There's no wedding dress, no dramatic chase through airports. But there is something else. A kind of love that begins where most stories end, in silence, in doubt, in the $500 cost of courage. If you've ever questioned your worth or wondered if healing could arrive in the most unexpected form, this story is for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. It was a crisp October morning in Rock Harbor, Oregon, the kind where the fog rolled in low over the coastline, softening the edges of everything it touched. Grace Whitmore sat quietly in the back row of the conference room, her notepad untouched, her coffee lukewarm. The windows rattled gently with the wind off the sea, but inside, the tension was sharp enough to cut through bone. She had always hated meetings, not because of the topics or the endless slides, but because they gave people like Derek a stage. And this morning, he was in full performance mode. Across the table, Derek Cooper leaned back in his chair with the smug ease of someone who'd never had to question his place in the room. He spoke over people. He interrupted. And somehow, the conversation had veered again into a thinly veiled jab at her. "I just think," Derek said, adjusting his cufflinks, "some people here don't realize this isn't a charity. Showing up early and staying late doesn't mean you're producing value." The room chuckled. Grace didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew he was staring at her. The words weren't new. Neither was the sting. But still. Her chest tightened the way it always did when humiliation arrived, wrapped in passive aggression. Sandra, seated beside her, shifted in her seat, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like disapproval. Grace gave a soft, grateful nod without turning her head. She wouldn't give Derek the satisfaction. The meeting dragged on. Grace took notes she'd never reread. When it finally ended, she escaped to her desk like a diver coming up for air. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed. She told herself it was from the cold, not from holding herself together for an hour straight. By the time she made it home that evening, the sky had darkened, and the coastal wind had grown teeth. Her house, if it could be called, that was a small, weathered rental tucked just off the shoreline. Paint chipped at the corners. The porch light flickered whenever it rained, but it was quiet, and in these days, that mattered more than anything. Inside, she slipped off her shoes and hung up her coat. The living room was dim, save for the soft glow of a table lamp and the old jazz record playing low on the stereo. Her mother sat in the recliner by the window, a blanket pulled up to her chin, eyes glazed with the kind of distance that no voice could reach. Grace walked over, placed a hand gently on her mother's shoulder. "Dinner soon," she whispered. She made a turkey sandwich on wheat bread. No mayonnaise, her mother never liked mayonnaise. They ate in silence, or, rather, Grace ate while her mother stared absently at the flickering TV. Later, after helping her into bed and humming a few bars of an old Patsy Cline song, Grace finally sat at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of peppermint tea. The quiet settled around her like an old friend, and yet, something inside her stirred, a tiny ember of restlessness, of need, of something unspoken. She opened her laptop. For a while, she just sat there, the screen glowing in the otherwise dark room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure. Then, almost against her better judgment, she typed Event Companion Service, Oregon. She paused, deleted it, rewrote it, then pressed enter. The search results were a strange mix, some sleek and professional, others borderline sketchy. She clicked through a few profiles, skimming names, faces, bios that sounded more like sales pitches than sincerity. She was about to close the tab when she saw it. James Halston. No flashy headline, no exaggerated promises. Just a simple headshot, mid-40s, clean-shaven, kind eyes that didn't quite smile, but didn't look empty either. Fee $500, location Oregon coast, availability, flexible bio. Sometimes people just need to be seen. I understand that. That was it. 10 words. But something in them landed differently. Grace leaned back in her chair, her breath caught somewhere between a scoff and a sigh. What was she doing? This was absurd, ridiculous, the kind of thing lonely people did in movies before getting scammed, and yet, she clicked into the profile. No reviews, no videos, just that same photograph and those same 10 words. Her eyes lingered on the request meeting button. She thought of the break room, of Derek's voice, of the way no one really saw her anymore, not the real her, not since before the 6-year relationship that had chipped away at her, worth one small comment at a time. She wasn't looking for love. She wasn't even looking for company. She just needed to feel like someone could look at her without seeing a burden. Her finger hovered, and then, slowly, deliberately, she clicked. Request submitted. You will be contacted shortly. The message blinked on the screen. Grace closed the laptop and stared at the shadows on the wall. She didn't know if she had just made a mistake, but for the first time in a long time, she had done something that belonged only to her. The Driftwood Bean Cafe sat quietly near the edge of Rock Harbor's old boardwalk, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside, meeting the chill October air. It was the kind of place locals passed by daily. The wood siding faded from years of salt spray, the bell above the door always ringing just a little too loudly. Grace arrived 10 minutes early. She always did. She chose a corner seat facing the door, partly to watch for him, partly because her back had learned the hard way not to trust open spaces. Her hands were clasped on the table, knuckles pale. She wasn't nervous exactly, more like braced. She half expected someone awkward, or worse, smug. Someone who would lean too close, speak too loud, or make jokes he thought she'd appreciate. She was preparing herself for disappointment. It had become second nature. But when the door opened at exactly 600 her breath caught in a way she hadn't anticipated. He didn't rush. He moved like someone who knew exactly where he was going, but had no need to hurry. James Halston was tall, dressed in a soft gray button-down and a dark wool coat that still held the cold. His hair was neatly kept, slightly graying at the temples, and his eyes clear, steady, and unreadable, moved calmly until they found hers. He smiled, just barely. Not the kind of smile that asks for approval. The kind that says, "I see you." Grace stood before she realized it. Her voice caught somewhere behind her ribs. He extended a hand, warm despite the chill, and simply said, "Miss Whitmore, I'm James." That was it. No overreaching charm. No comment on her appearance. Just that even tone, like they were meeting for something as ordinary as signing papers or attending a wake. They sat, the server came by, and James ordered black coffee. Grace asked for tea, her voice steadier than she felt. Outside, the last light of sunset brushed against the windows, painting their reflections in faint gold and gray. For the first several minutes, James asked questions. Not about her personally, nothing invasive. He inquired about the event time, location, dress code, expected behavior. His questions were precise, even thoughtful, as though he'd done this before, but never assumed too much. Grace found herself answering with more clarity than she expected. He nodded occasionally, jotting down a note or two on a small notepad he pulled from his coat. She noticed how neatly he wrote. Each letter had purpose. But the more he spoke, the more something unsettled her, not in a dangerous way, but in the way someone might be unsettled by finding a violinist playing alone in the woods. Beautiful, out of place. James didn't act like someone doing a side gig. He didn't fidget. He didn't overshare. He held himself like a man who had been in rooms that mattered and didn't need to prove it anymore. She caught herself watching the way he stirred his coffee without looking down, the way he folded his napkin before placing it on his lap. There was a stillness in him, almost too still. "You seem—" she started, then stopped. He glanced up, amused but not mocking. "Yes." Grace shook her head. "Never mind." He smiled faintly, then leaned back in his chair. "Just one thing," he said gently. "If anything tomorrow becomes uncomfortable, or someone pushes too far, say cranberry juice 3 times. She blinked. Cranberry juice. His expression didn't change. "That'll be my signal to step in, reset the scene, or get you out altogether. No explanations needed." Grace tilted her head, trying to read him. "Have you had to use that before?" "Only once," he replied, "but it worked." She nodded slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting. A code word. Professional and oddly tender. Like he had thought about safety in a way most people didn't. It didn't feel rehearsed. It felt considerate. When the check came, he paid for both. Grace started to protest, but he shook his head lightly. "I invited you," he said. "This counts as my preparation." They stepped outside together. The air had cooled, the scent of the ocean stronger now, edged with salt and something older. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows on the wooden planks of the boardwalk. James turned to her. He didn't reach out, he didn't linger, but he held her gaze for a moment longer than expected. "You don't need to worry about anything, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Not tonight, not ever." Then he turned, walking down the boardwalk, disappearing into the soft hum of the town settling into night. Grace stood there for a while, arms crossed against the breeze, eyes still locked on where he had been. She didn't understand it. She had just met him. He hadn't touched her hand more than once, hadn't asked a single personal question, hadn't flattered her, hadn't flirted. But somehow, he had looked at her like she wasn't invisible. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She sat by the window of her little house, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the kettle forgotten on the stove. Outside, the ocean whispered against the rocks, a steady rhythm like breath. She watched the sky darken and shift, stars blinking into view one by one, as if called there by the ache in her chest, and for the first time in a very long while. Grace Whitmore had a secret. The Fisherman's Light was a restaurant built into the bones of an old dockside cannery, its wooden beams soaked with decades of salt air and fish stories. It was the kind of place that tried to blend rustic charm with coastal elegance, mason jars for water. Linen napkins folded into triangles, candles flickering against exposed brick. Oceanside Realty had rented the entire second floor for their 20th anniversary celebration. A soft string quartet played in the corner, and the bar served an open tab that already had Derek's ego 3 drinks ahead of his manners. Grace stood near the railing, looking out at the harbor. Boats rocked gently under the silver wash of moonlight, their sails folded like tired wings. She exhaled slowly, adjusting the hem of her dress. Navy blue, simple, modest, the kind of thing that let her disappear just enough to breathe. Then she heard it, the shift in conversation. Voices quieted just slightly. Heads turned, and when she followed their gaze, she saw him. James. He stepped through the entrance with quiet authority, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit like it had been measured more by instinct than tape. His black tie was clean, understated. His shoes dark leather, shined to perfection, made no sound against the floor. Grace's breath caught in her throat. He looked inevitable, like he'd always been meant to be there. James met her eyes across the room. No smile, no nod, just a calm recognition. Then, as if they'd rehearsed it 100 times. He walked directly to her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, offering his arm. And just like that, they stepped into the crowd. Gasps were silent, but unmistakable. Whispers filled the spaces between the string music. Co-workers nudged each other subtly. Even the event photographer took an extra step back to capture the unexpected tableau. Grace held her posture, her hand resting lightly on James's arm. She could feel his presence beneath the fabric, solid, composed, safe. They made small talk with managers, smiled politely at overeager interns, and accepted glasses of champagne they didn't drink. James was courteous but brief, never inserting himself too much into conversation, yet somehow never seeming absent. His silences carried weight, his glances held intent. And then came Derek. He approached like a dog that had just remembered its territory, a smirk already half formed, his shirt collar slightly wilted, tie loose like he'd forgotten there were cameras. "Well, look at this," Derek said, swirling his glass. "Didn't realize we hired security for tonight." Grace tensed, but James didn't flinch. He turned to Derek with a composed expression, offering his hand. "James Halston, Grace's guest." Derek hesitated, then shook it reluctantly. "Derek Cooper," he said, leaning a bit closer. "We work together. Used to be a little more than that. If you catch my drift." James didn't blink. "I don't usually catch things I'm not looking for." The silence that followed was brief, but delicious. Derek forced a chuckle and retreated toward the bar, defeated but still simmering. Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. James glanced at her, just briefly, and said, "Cranberry juice, count 0. She smiled, unable to help it. Later that evening, they sat together at one of the long tables near the bay windows. The conversation around them buzzed with half-drunken laughter, clinking glasses, and stories that grew taller with each retelling. James asked about the town. Grace told him what she knew, how Rock Harbor had once been a booming fishing hub, how the cannery had closed in the 80s, how tourism had become its second life. Then he spoke. Not much, just enough. But the room leaned in. He mentioned zoning laws, land usage trends, and how small towns could benefit from community-focused development. He referenced city planners by name, talked about historic preservation with the gentle reverence of someone who'd seen it all disappear before. People listened, even the senior partners, Sandra, who had worked at Oceanside Realty since the Clinton administration, narrowed her eyes across the table. She leaned toward Grace, her voice low, barely above the sound of her wine glass touching the table. "Sweetheart," she said, "I swear I've seen that man on the Oregon Business Journal." Grace blinked. "What?" Sandra nodded slowly. 2 months ago. Front page of the finance section. Something about downtown revitalization and affordable housing. I don't forget a face like that. Or a suit like that. Grace forced a laugh, but her fingers tightened slightly around her fork. She looked at James, who was now politely declining a third round of questions from a junior agent. His gaze moved to her again, steady, unreadable. She smiled, because that's what you do when you're being watched. But inside, something shifted. She thought about the way he carried himself, the things he didn't say, the way he never once asked her anything personal and yet made her feel more known than people who'd known her for years. Her stomach twisted gently. Not with fear, exactly, but with the slow dawning of a question that couldn't be answered tonight. Who are you, James Halston, and what exactly am I inviting into my life? That night, back at home. Grace stood in front of the bathroom mirror, removing her earrings slowly. The house was quiet. Her mother was asleep. The dress still held his scent, something clean, faintly cedar, and maddeningly hard to forget. She stared at her reflection, at the woman who had once felt small in every room Derek walked into. Tonight, that same woman had walked beside someone who made the room quieter, not louder. But even as the warmth lingered, so did the whisper of doubt, and that whisper was growing. They met again the next morning, at a quieter place, far from the watchful eyes of the co-workers and curious neighbors. Not the driftwood bean this time, but a small tea house tucked into a garden behind the old lighthouse. The kind of place where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of seagulls drifting overhead. James was already there when Grace arrived, seated under a pergola laced with dried wisteria, his coat folded neatly over the back of the chair beside him. He stood when he saw her, always so effortlessly composed, as if he lived in a slower world than everyone else. They didn't talk much at first. Grace sipped her tea while James stirred honey into his coffee, his eyes watching the way the liquid spiraled and stilled. There was a peace to him, a quietness that made it easy to breathe. Maybe that's why she started talking, really talking. She told him about her mother, how the woman who once ran bake sales and coached school plays now stared at the TV like it was a window to nowhere. She spoke of the late nights, the fear of forgetting the woman before the illness, of the slow erosion of someone you love, moment by moment, memory by memory. James didn't interrupt. He didn't offer cliches or try to fix anything. He just listened, and somehow that was enough. But as the conversation shifted, something shifted with it. Grace mentioned that her company had been under pressure, lately delayed approvals, staff cuts, whispers about acquisition. She didn't go into detail, just enough to explain the strange tension in the office. That's when he said it. Is the pending zoning approval for the beachside lot causing the holdup? The question was so specific, so cleanly inserted into the flow of conversation, that for a moment she didn't register it. Then she did. She looked at him. His face was neutral, not apologetic, not smug, just waiting. Grace smiled politely, as though he'd asked about the weather. Sorry, she said lightly. What lot? James stirred his coffee again. The parcel Oceanside's been trying to push through for months. South of Harborview, I read about it. Interesting play for a mid-tier firm. Mid-tier. Her pulse thudded in her ears. No one outside the inner circle used that language, not even most clients. And certainly not a freelance companion who claimed to be between things. She gave a soft laugh, trying to mask the flicker of alarm beneath her ribs. You keep up with zoning reports. James looked up, his gaze even. I pay attention to places I care about. Grace forced another sip of tea, though her mouth had gone dry. The rest of the conversation drifted back into safer waters, travel stories, books they'd meant to read, whether fall or spring felt lonelier. James spoke less, or perhaps Grace listened less. Her thoughts were no longer steady. After they finished, James stood and helped her with her coat. He didn't ask for another meeting, didn't press for plans, just walked her to her car and opened the door. Before she got in, he paused. You know, he said, voice low, not everything is about who we appear to be. Grace blinked, unsure if it was a warning or a confession. Then he nodded once and turned away, walking down the path lined with maple trees, losing their color. That evening, back in her dim kitchen, Grace stared at her reflection in the microwave door. She didn't want to be this version of herself, the suspicious one, the woman who read too much into every detail, who second-guessed kindness and dissected tone. But something wasn't lining up. She sat at the kitchen table, pulled the laptop toward her, and opened a new browser tab, James Halston. She typed it in carefully, fingers tense over the keys, then added James Halston plus Business Oregon. The blinking cursor waited, but she didn't press enter, not yet. She stared at the screen. The blue light painted faint shadows on her hands, making her wedding band tan line visible again. Derek had always hated that she wore it for so long after the engagement ended, but she never did it for him. She did it because she wasn't sure who she was without someone else's name on her skin. James hadn't touched her, hadn't made a move, hadn't even flirted, and yet he was in her mind more than he should have been. Who was this man who knew things he shouldn't, who showed up in her world like a mirror with a secret? Her finger hovered above the key. And still, she didn't press it, not yet. Instead, she closed the lid. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees rattled like old memories, and somewhere beyond them, the ocean whispered secrets to the shore. Grace stood, poured the rest of her tea down the sink, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd look. The client's name was Richard Gaines, a local developer with more ambition than subtlety. He liked to drop names like breadcrumbs, as if everyone around him should feel lucky just to follow. He arrived at Oceanside Realty that morning in a tailored suit and cologne that lingered in hallways long after he passed. Grace had met him once before briefly and hadn't thought much of him since. But today, he strutted into the conference room like he owned half the coastline. She was there only to deliver printed reports, background noise, the secretary. As she set the folder on the table, Richard grinned broadly and extended a hand. Grace, right? The famous Miss Whitmore, he said, clearly pleased with himself. So, tell me, how's Mr. Halston? Still playing it low-key, or has he finally let on who he really is? She blinked. I'm sorry. He laughed. James Halston, from Halston Group. You didn't know he leaned in, as if sharing a joke. Guess the man still knows how to keep a secret. She smiled faintly, nodded, then walked out as if her feet still remembered how. Her hands didn't shake until she reached the elevator. That night, Grace sat in her car outside the driftwood bean, watching the tide pull away from the shore like a curtain drawn too fast. The dashboard clock blinked, soft and steady. Her phone was in her lap. The screen glowed with the results of a search she should have done weeks ago. James Halston, Oregon, real estate. The articles were everywhere. CEO of the Halston Group, one of the most discreet but powerful development firms in the Pacific Northwest. Known for revitalizing old coastal towns, for buying up mid-size agencies and folding them into larger investments. And Oceanside Realty was rumored to be next. She clicked through images conferences, ribbon cuttings, charity events. There he was, the same man who'd stirred honey into his coffee and told her she didn't need to worry. The same man who had stood beside her in candlelight and whispered protection into her ear. Only now, he wore different suits, shook different hands, wore a name that echoed in boardrooms and investment summaries. She shut the laptop. Not everything is about who we appear to be. His words from 2 days ago now rang differently. Her breath was shallow, her palms damp against the steering wheel. And yet, some part of her wasn't surprised. Not really. The calm, the knowledge, the way he had asked about zoning laws like he already knew the answers. She had felt it all before she could name it. But feeling and knowing were two different things. And now, knowing hurt. She texted him, "Meet me at the Cove." No punctuation, no emoji. Just enough to let him know she wasn't asking. The Cove was a stretch of beach tucked behind the cliffs, quiet and shielded from the boardwalk. There was a bench near the old fire pit, weathered from salt and wind. Grace arrived early. Let the cold settle into her bones. The ocean air was sharper tonight. No fog, no soft light, just moonlit waves and wind that spoke plainly. James arrived 5 minutes later. No coat, just that same composure. Slightly worn now. He didn't sit. "I guess you know," he said softly. Grace didn't look up. "You're the CEO of the company buying ours." A pause. Then, "Yes." She turned to him slowly. Her voice didn't rise. "You let me bring you into that room. You let me introduce you to people I've worked beside for a decade while you were planning to turn them into numbers on a spreadsheet." He stepped forward slightly, but she held up a hand. The gesture wasn't angry, it was tired. "I didn't come here to be tricked. James," she said. "Not again." "I didn't trick you," he said. "I didn't lie. You omitted the truth. That's worse sometimes." Wind caught her scarf and tugged it sideways. She didn't fix it. "I didn't approach you because of Oceanside," he said. "I'd already seen the company's name on a list. I didn't know your name was on it, too." Grace turned to face him fully now. Her eyes didn't shimmer. They burned. "And when you found out he looked at the sand, I should have told you. But you didn't." "No." Silence stretched long and thin between them. She crossed her arms, holding herself. "You say you stayed because of me. But how am I supposed to believe anything now? Every moment we spent together, every kind word was that part of the pitch. He met her gaze. Finally, Grace, I stayed for you, not the deal. That's what every man says when he gets caught. She didn't yell. That would have made it easier. Instead, she let the quiet carry the weight. He took a breath, stepped closer. You have every right to be angry. I kept things from you, not out of malice. Out of fear that if I told you too soon, I'd lose the one good thing I hadn't planned for. She flinched at that, because some part of her wanted to believe it. That part that still remembered the warmth of his voice, the way he watched her with gentleness and never asked for more than she could give. But that wasn't enough. Not now, not here. She stepped back, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and low. You should have just said the price up front. Then she walked past him, the sand crunching beneath her heels like glass. James didn't follow. He stood there, motionless. For once, the man who owned rooms, who had built cities and companies and facades, looked small, not in stature, but in the space he had once filled so easily. The wind didn't pause for him. The sea didn't ask what he'd lost. Only the waves remained, crashing over stone. The silence came slowly, like fog over the harbor, gentle at first, then consuming. Grace waited, at first, not consciously, but in the spaces between brushing her mother's hair and folding laundry. She found herself glancing at her phone. When it buzzed, her heart still leapt before logic caught up. But there was nothing from James. Not a message, not a missed call, not even a word through someone else. And so, the silence settled. She didn't reach out either. Pride, perhaps, or fear, maybe both. Instead, she returned to the rhythm that had defined her for so long, the quiet caretaking, the muted laughter in the break room, the meals for one. The days moved forward in small, forgettable ways. At home, her mother had good days and bad. On the good ones, she would hum old hymns and recognize Grace's name. On the bad ones, she stared through her, as if Grace were a shadow moving across a wall. Work was harder now. Oceanside Realty, once bustling with energy, had begun to dim. Conversations happened behind closed doors more often. Meetings ended with tight smiles and quick exits. The whispers of acquisition had become murmurs of resignation. Grace tried to keep her head down, tried to do her job like it still mattered. But the truth pressed on her chest like a weight she couldn't name. At night, she didn't sleep well. She'd lie awake long after her mother had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind played with the loose gutter outside her window. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and see his face, not the one in boardroom photos, but the one in candlelight, or beneath a pergola, listening without interrupting. She hated that she missed him. And still, she did. One night, close to midnight, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea. The house was quiet, save for the faint whir of the old refrigerator. Her laptop sat open, the screen dark. She touched the trackpad, and the light returned. She didn't know what she was doing, what she was hoping to find, but her fingers moved instinctively, opening her email, scrolling through the inbox she hadn't cleaned in months. And there it was, the message. Your booking has been confirmed. Companion James Halston, fee $500. It was still there, unread, unopened since that night. Grace clicked it slowly. The text was brief, sterile, transactional, and yet, her eyes lingered on the name, James Halston. It looked so different now, like a stranger's name wearing someone else's face. She sat there for a long while, not crying, not even angry, just hollow. The next morning, just before logging into a staff meeting, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sandra. You hear the news Halston Group pulled out? Word is the deal's off. Grace stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered over the reply, but she didn't type anything. Instead, her thoughts turned inward. He'd left. Had he done it because of her, or had the deal soured for business reasons? She didn't know which answer would hurt more. A part of her wanted to believe it was about her that he had meant it when he said he stayed for her, That walking away was his way of saying sorry. But another part, the quieter, more cautious version of herself, whispered that she had simply been an inconvenience to a larger plan, a footnote, an asterisk. That afternoon, the office was filled with a strange energy, relief for some, disappointment for others, for Grace. It was just a numb kind of clarity. She went home early. The mailbox in front of her house was crooked, leaning slightly after the last storm. She checked it more out of habit than expectation. Inside, nestled between flyers and a utility bill, was a small, cream-colored envelope with no return address. The handwriting was neat, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. She walked slowly inside, set her keys down, and carried the envelope to the kitchen counter like it might shatter if handled too fast. It wasn't heavy, just thick enough to suggest more than one page. There, in the corner, where a subject line would usually sit, was a title written in his handwriting, Letters I Never Sent. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she placed it on the table, beside the old ceramic mug that still held her untouched tea from the night before. The house was quiet. Her mother slept in the next room, and for the first time in weeks, Grace felt something stir, not peace, not closure, just the gentle, unmistakable hum of something unfinished. The envelope stayed unopened on the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Grace made tea, didn't drink it, checked on her mother, stared out the window as the rain began its slow descent, soft at first, like a whisper, then steady, like grief you've given permission to stay. She finally sat down, the envelope between her hands. The paper was thick, the seal already broken, as if meant to say, "You can look now. It's safe." Inside was a fabric folder, pale blue linen with frayed edges. Letters I Never Sent, embroidered in small, almost timid letters. She ran her thumb across the words. The thread was slightly raised. Someone had taken their time with it. She opened it, 15 envelopes, each one labeled with a date and a location. Some she remembered vividly. Others she had to think twice about. The earliest was from the day after their first meeting at the Driftwood Bean. The latest, dated only a week ago, was marked simply, The Cove. Her hands trembled. She opened the first. October 13th, Driftwood Bean. 6:08 p.m. You wore navy. You crossed your arms when you felt uncertain. You tried to hide your nervousness behind perfect posture. It didn't work, but it made me want to protect you more. I didn't expect to feel anything. Not really. But there was something in the way you said my name, like it didn't belong to a corporation. Like I was a person before I was a profile. She stopped halfway through the second letter. The words blurred. Tears came quietly, as if they'd been waiting at the edge of her vision all week. They didn't ask permission. They simply arrived. Each letter felt like a thread pulled gently through her chest, tightening, unraveling, stitching. He wrote about things she never thought he'd noticed. The way she pressed her lips together when unsure. The small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands when someone raised their voice. How she always waited 2 seconds longer than necessary before leaving a conversation, just in case someone needed her to stay. November 2nd's corporate dinner. You walked into that room like you wanted to disappear, but you didn't. You stood next to me and let them look, and I knew it took everything you had not to shrink. I wanted to take your hand that night. But I knew if I did, I'd stop pretending this wasn't real. Some letters were just a few lines, others full pages. Some were unfinished thoughts that trailed off, as if his courage had ended before the sentence could. But the one she read 5 times was dated the night they argued on the beach. November 18th, The Cove. You looked at me like I had burned down the only house you felt safe in. And maybe I did. I didn't come into your life to play a game. I came into it hoping selfishly that I could be someone real with you before being someone rich. But I didn't give you the truth soon enough, and I don't blame you for walking away. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I hope you remember how quiet the waves were that night, and how I didn't chase you, not because I didn't care, but because I knew you needed to leave before you could choose to return." Grace folded the paper carefully, placing it back in its envelope as though it were made of something fragile. She reached for the last one. The flap wasn't sealed. Her fingers trembled again, slower this time. "If you're reading this, then I've already walked away. From the deal, from the plan, from everything that made sense before you. I don't want to be the man who shows up with strategy. I want to be the one who waits with hope. If you ever feel what I felt, if your silence wasn't absence but protection, I'll be at the lighthouse. The one we passed on our third walk. The one with the red door you said reminded you of childhood and endings and beginnings. I'll be there, every day at 5 p.m. For 7 days. No pressure, no expectation. Just the door, just me." James Grace sat still for a long moment. Outside, the rain tapped harder against the window panes. She looked at the clock on the stove. 4:47 p.m. She rose so fast the chair scraped back against the tile. She didn't grab an umbrella. She didn't put on makeup or reapply lipstick. She only took the fabric folder and pressed it close to her chest like a map that only made sense now. As she stepped outside, the sky opened wider. Water soaked into her sleeves, her shoes, her hair. But Grace kept walking, because some letters aren't meant to be stored. They're meant to be answered. The rain had slowed, but the fog had thickened. Grace's windshield wipers moved in slow arcs, not fast enough to clear her thoughts. Headlights cut through the mist, like ghostly arms reaching for something not yet found. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, damp and trembling, as she followed the curve of the coastal road. She had taken this road before, many times, but never like this. Never with her heart pounding against the inside of her chest like it was trying to speak first. Outside, the trees along the cliff swayed gently, their outlines softened by the fog. The ocean, hidden just beyond the bluffs, made itself known only by sound, a low, steady breath, deep and eternal. Each mile marker passed like a memory. The coffee shop where they first sat across from one another. The inn with the garden pergola where she'd told him about her mother. The restaurant with the candlelight where he'd whispered that she need not worry. And now, the lighthouse. It stood ahead, barely visible until she was nearly upon it, a gray silhouette against a sky the color of old linen. Its red door was closed, the same door she'd once pointed to and called the color of beginnings. Grace pulled over and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt louder than the road. She stepped out into the cold. The rain had become a mist, the kind that didn't fall but floated, settling into the folds of her coat and the spaces between strands of her hair. She pulled the fabric folder closer to her chest like a compass. The gravel crunched under her boots as she walked the short path toward the lighthouse. There was no wind, no sound but the distant churn of water and her own breath. And then she saw him. Through the small glass window in the door, standing near the tall pane of the lighthouse's observation room, James was facing the sea, one hand tucked into his coat pocket, the other holding a worn umbrella, the same old black one he had offered to carry that first rainy morning outside the cafe. He hadn't changed, or maybe he had, but in ways only she could see. He didn't look up when she opened the door, didn't startle when the rusted hinges gave a small groan. He knew she'd come. Grace stepped inside slowly, letting the door close behind her with a click softer than expected. The room smelled faintly of sea salt and old wood, like a place that remembered every person who had once waited here. She took a breath, then another. James turned. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just watched her with eyes that no longer guarded themselves. For a moment, maybe more, they stood like that. Strangers again, but only in distance, not in truth. Grace's throat was dry. Her hands trembled. She reached into her coat pocket and held up the folder, not as proof, just as answer. "I read them," she said softly. That was all. That was everything. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of held breath, of almosts, of things too important to rush. James looked down, then back up. His voice, when it came, was the same as she remembered, quiet, even, but now without any mask. Then, "Do I still owe you that $500? At first, she didn't react. And then she laughed. It was a small, surprised sound that escaped like a note in an old song. And just as quickly, she cried, not with sobs, not with drama, just the kind of crying that comes when your chest finally loosens after holding something too tightly for too long. James stepped forward. Slowly, like he was learning how. He didn't touch her, not yet. He only stood close enough for her to feel that he was real. Grace wiped at her face with the back of her hand. "You're still awful at timing." He smiled, faintly. "I had to try." Her eyes met his, still wet but steady. "You waited 7 days." He said, "Today is the 7th. She looked past him, out to the sea. "It's not too late." "No," he said gently. "It's not." They stood like that for a while, as the fog thickened outside and the light in the tower flickered on, casting long shadows across the old floorboards. Neither reached for the other right away, because this moment didn't need to be fixed. It only needed to be held. The rain hadn't stopped, but neither had they. Inside the lighthouse, the world outside grew quiet fog, softening the sound of the waves, time seeming to stretch itself thin enough for second chances. They didn't rush to fill the silence. Grace leaned lightly against the wooden railing near the window. James stood a few feet away, the folder of letters still tucked under her arm, like a weight she had learned to carry differently now. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I canceled the acquisition. Officially." She turned slightly, not surprised, but waiting for more. "I read in the internal memo," he continued, "that they were preparing to restructure. You were one of the names, not because of performance, just cuts." Grace looked down at her hands, fingers curled around each other. "So, you walked away," she said, not as a question. James nodded. Oceanside wasn't worth it if it meant gutting people who made it what it was. He paused, then smiled faintly. "Besides, there was another investment I wanted to make." Grace raised an eyebrow. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. No fanfare. Just the quiet offering of something that had already been decided. "I signed over 5% equity in a new community housing project. It's the senior care initiative I mentioned that night at the cafe, the one near Cannon Bay." Grace took the paper carefully. Her eyes scanned the words slowly, deliberately. "You said it was still in concept," she murmured. I pushed it forward. He said, "After you told me about your mom, about the waiting list, the lack of dignity in the places that are supposed to feel like home." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I didn't do it for you to owe me," he said gently, "or to fix things. I just wanted to build something that mattered to someone. To you." She exhaled slowly, the words resting heavy in the air. "James, I won't pay for kindness with feelings." He took a step closer. Not too close. His expression didn't waver. "This isn't a deal," he said. "It's a beginning." Grace looked at him then. Really looked. Not the man from glossy articles, not the suited figure in her company's break room, but the one who'd watched her fold sandwich corners with too much precision. The one who'd noticed how she blinked twice before saying something vulnerable. The one who waited and was still here. Later that evening, they left the lighthouse together, not with declarations, but with something quieter, decision. They drove in silence, Grace watching the road while James sat beside her, his hand occasionally brushing against hers on the gear shift. No promises were spoken, but something unspoken settled between them like the ending of a long-held breath. They didn't go back to the office, didn't talk about Oceanside Realty again. Instead, they stopped at the same cafe where it all began. The Driftwood Bean was almost empty, save for an elderly couple playing dominoes in the corner and a young man tapping gently on a laptop near the window. The barista gave them a familiar nod, as if they'd been regulars all along. They sat at the same table. The rain tapped the glass. Grace stirred her tea absent-mindedly, the steam rising in quiet curls. James watched her, then finally said, no contracts. Then she smiled, a real smile, soft and a little uneven. No contracts, she said. Just promises. He reached across the table not urgently, just naturally, and took her hand. No applause, no fanfare, just warmth, just two people choosing, despite everything, to begin again. A year later, the sign outside read, Harbor Hearth Foundation. Hope lives here. It wasn't flashy, no bold logo, no towering glass. Just a single-story building with weathered wood siding, wildflowers planted by volunteers, and rocking chairs on the porch where the wind carried the scent of salt and lavender. Inside, it was always warm, not just from the heaters tucked into the walls, but from the people. The laughter that echoed down the hallways, the soft sounds of piano on Sunday afternoons, the quiet comfort of someone remembering your name, even when you'd forgotten your own. Grace had built that, not with concrete or spreadsheets, but with her story. She didn't talk about James much in public, not because she was hiding him, but because the story was never just about him, or her. It was about all the women who'd sat in quiet kitchens with voices full of silence, the ones who held up entire lives without applause. Harbor Hearth wasn't a business. It was a place where those women could walk in and feel seen. She handled outreach, communications, partnerships with local artists and nurses. She sat in on city council meetings, made coffee for board members, wrote every letter by hand the first 6 months. And somehow, in all of that doing, she healed. Her mother now lived in one of the first units, apartment 3B, a corner room with soft morning light. Some days were lucid, filled with humming and memories of her youth in Maine. Other days were fogged over, but she smiled more. And Grace had learned to stop grieving the moments that vanished and start honoring the ones that stayed. James worked more behind the scenes, grant writing, legal groundwork, construction oversight, but every Friday, they had lunch together at the cafe down the street. He never stopped bringing the umbrella, even on dry days. One early autumn morning, the foundation hosted its first community circle, a simple gathering in the event room with folding chairs, cinnamon rolls, and a mic that didn't always work. Grace was last on the list. She didn't prepare notes. She stood, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and looked at the 30 or so people seated before her residence, staff, neighbors, and strangers who'd heard there's something healing happening on Harbor Way. She cleared her throat once, then spoke. I used to think strength meant saying nothing, pushing through, being the last one to leave the office, the first one to check on a loved one, the only one to never complain. But silence is heavy, and when you carry it long enough, you forget how to ask for help, or love, or anything. A few years ago, I thought I had lost everything, but what I'd really lost was permission to want more, to need less noise, to be softer without being broken. This place, this building isn't just about housing. It's about stories. Some we speak, some we write in letters we never send, but all of them matter, and none of them deserve to be whispered. She hadn't meant to cry, but the words came from so deep inside her that even her own hands trembled slightly on the mic. When she sat down, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then, a woman in the third row, mid-60s, graying hair in a loose braid, stood up and walked toward her. She didn't ask permission. She just opened her arms, and Grace let herself be held. The woman whispered, "I thought I was the only one." Grace shook her head, still nestled against the softness of a stranger's shoulder. "No," she whispered back, "you never were." Afterward, she stepped outside alone. The sun had broken through the morning haze, and the wind carried the scent of something new blooming. Behind her, the voices of the gathering continued. Inside, Harbor Hearth was still alive. But Grace stood still for a moment longer, her hand resting on the wooden railing of the porch, not looking for anyone, just feeling. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She wasn't performing strength. She wasn't measuring her worth against what she gave up. She was simply there, in the life she had chosen to build, in the hope she had unknowingly become. And somewhere in the distance, A lighthouse still stood quiet and unwavering, but she didn't need its light anymore, because now she carried her own. The sun filtered gently through the gauze curtains of her home office, catching the dust in the air like slow-moving stars. Grace stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, sleeves rolled up, a half-empty mug of tea cooling on the windowsill. She hadn't planned to clean out the filing cabinet. It just happened, the way some healing does not from grand intention, but from quiet instinct. She opened the bottom drawer, where things were kept just in case. Tax forms, utility bills from a rental she no longer lived in, a card from her mother with no message, just a drawing of a rose she must have traced from memory. And then beneath a stack of expired insurance policies she saw it, a plain white envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges, the glue no longer holding the flap shut. She paused. There was no name on it, just a date, scrawled in her own handwriting, October 2023. She slid her finger beneath the flap and unfolded the paper inside. It was thinner than she remembered. Standard print, invoice style, one line item, event companion service, 3 HRs, total $500 status paid in Grace, handwritten in dark blue ink. She smiled, but it wasn't just a smile. It was a slow, layered kind of expression. One born of memory, of the distance between then and now. That receipt hadn't bought love. It hadn't even bought company. It had opened a door she didn't know was locked. She sat on the edge of her chair and let herself remember the woman who had typed Event Companion Oregon into her browser that night. Not out of desperation, but out of exhaustion. The kind that no sleep can cure. The kind that comes from holding up too many people while quietly forgetting your own name. That night, she'd taken a risk not on a man, but on the faintest flicker of belief that she was allowed to want more. And somehow, the world had met her halfway. The sound of wind moved through the trees outside. Grace looked over to the shelf by the window, where a small photo of her mother sat, framed in soft gray wood. Her mother was smiling in the picture. It had been taken on one of her clear days when she had remembered Grace's name, even if just for an hour, and insisted on baking a blueberry pie from scratch like the old days. The crust had been burnt, the filling too sweet, but it was perfect. Grace got up and walked slowly to the nearby drawer. Inside was a small, unused photo frame. She opened it, slipped the receipt inside, and closed the latch with a soft click. She placed it beside her mother's picture, two pieces of her history now sitting side by side. One, a woman who had given her life. The other, a receipt for the day she chose to live it fully. That evening, the house smelled of roasted squash and rosemary. James had texted that his plane landed early. No grand gestures, no reservations. Just a quiet return from a short work trip in Seattle. Grace lit a candle in the living room, not for ambiance, but for stillness. When he arrived, he didn't speak at first. He opened the door, shook the rain off his coat, and looked at her in the soft lamplight. She didn't move toward him. He crossed the room slowly, and then arms around her, chin resting near her temple, silence wrapping them like a second skin. It wasn't a moment for words. It was the kind of moment that remembers every other moment, the shaky beginnings, the questions, the silence between sentences. He hadn't seen the receipt. She hadn't told him about it. She didn't need to. Some memories are sacred simply because they're yours alone. Later that night, while the rain softened the world outside, Grace curled up on the couch with a blanket, her head resting on James's shoulder. His breathing was steady. His hand traced circles on the fabric near her elbow. She looked across the room, where the photo and the receipt sat on the shelf, side by side. Old love, new hope, the cost of learning to choose herself, and the gift of being chosen, not for the version of herself that smiled on cue, but for the woman who had once quietly folded a receipt and tucked it away, believing it mattered. It had rained the night before the fall harvest festival, leaving the town square wrapped in the scent of wet leaves and cinnamon. By morning, the sky was soft and open, brushed in hues of cream and blue. The air carried the crispness of apples and baked crust, with the faint hum of old country music coming from a portable speaker near the firehouse. Grace stood beneath a string of paper lanterns, her scarf gently tugged by the breeze. The years hadn't made her louder, but they had made her steadier. There was a grace to her now earned, not given, a calm that made space for others. Beside her, James adjusted the wooden sign hanging at their booth. Community cider and cookies, proceeds to Harbor Hearth. But it was the smaller sign, hanging just below it, that made people pause and smile. Love doesn't have a price, but it might start at $500. They didn't explain it, they didn't need to. It was the kind of joke that meant something only if you'd lived it. The booth smelled of warm apple cider and molasses cookies. The recipe Grace had finally gotten just right. Children ran past with sticky fingers. An elderly couple stopped to rest on the nearby bench, holding hands like it was a religion. James handed a cup of cider to an older gentleman and said, almost absently, "She didn't save my business. She saved me from it." The man chuckled, not quite understanding. "Sounds like a good trade." James nodded. "The best one I ever made. A few feet away." Grace laughed at something a teenager had said. She was crouched near the cider thermos, wiping a spill with a cloth napkin. Her hair was tied back loosely, and there was a flour smudge on her cheek she hadn't noticed. James watched her for a moment, not with awe, not with disbelief, just with the quiet knowing of someone who had learned that real love doesn't announce itself. It simply stays. When Grace stood, brushing her knees, she turned toward James and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You know," she said, "I used to think I was just a secretary." James didn't correct her. He waited. Grace smiled. "But you reminded me I never was." He reached for her hand and brought it to his chest. "And I was never just a CEO." Their moment was interrupted by the laughter of children nearby and the smell of caramel wafting from the vendor across the square. It wasn't a storybook ending, no string quartet, no white dress or champagne tower, but it was everything they never knew they needed. The afternoon passed in small conversations and shared cookies. A woman who just moved into Harbor Hearth stopped by with her grandson. A city council member dropped off a donation. A retired librarian left a note that simply read, "Thank you for making space for soft people." Later, as the lanterns flickered and the first chill of evening brushed the air, Grace stood by the booth alone while James walked to the truck for more cider. She looked around the square, the same square where she had once walked home alone, head low, avoiding eye contact. A place that had once felt like a mirror, reflecting everything she wasn't. Now, it felt like a hearth. Not because she had conquered it, but because she had stayed long enough to soften it. When James returned, they didn't speak for a while. They just stood together, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky dim and the lights glow warmer. He passed her a cup of cider. "Still warm," he said. Grace took a sip and nodded. "Still real." Before packing up, they removed the little sign from the front of the table. Grace wiped the corner gently, her thumb brushing over the carved letters. "Love doesn't have a price, but it might start at $500. They laughed softly. Because the truth was, Grace Whitmore had been just a secretary once. She had been tired, invisible, small, and she had hired a stranger for a night because she didn't know how else to believe she mattered. But now she knew that night hadn't been the beginning of love. It had been the beginning of her. That night, as they walked home hand in hand, the town quieted behind them, the lights grew distant, the air cool. James carried the folded sign under one arm. Grace leaned her head gently on his shoulder. No music, no applause, just the hush of two people who had chosen not to be rescued, but to rebuild. Together. And on the shelf at home, next to a photograph of Grace's mother and a framed receipt from long ago, there would soon be one more addition. A piece of wood, hand-carved, simple. She was just a secretary hiring a $500 date, until a millionaire CEO changed her life. But in the end, it was she who changed his. Sometimes, the most unexpected paths lead us back to ourselves. This story isn't about romance in the usual sense. It's about quiet courage, about a woman who dared to take one small, strange step, and ended up rewriting her life. Too often, we think it's too late to change. We get used to the noise of duty, routine, and loss, and forget that we still have a say in how our story unfolds. Grace didn't find healing in grand gestures or perfect endings. She found it in moments: a warm drink, a shared silence, a letter never sent. The real love wasn't in being rescued, but in realizing she was never truly lost. We all carry receipts of pain, of choices, of chances not taken. But sometimes, what feels like a transaction becomes transformation. So, if you've ever felt invisible or thought your best chapters were behind you, remember it's never too late to choose yourself. Sometimes the world meets you halfway, but first, you have to knock. Thank you for spending your time with us and letting this story into your heart. If it touched you in any way, if it made you feel seen, comforted, or simply reminded you that healing is still possible, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to Shining Stories. Your support helps us keep telling the quiet stories that matter most.